London in the 1600s had already grown into one of the largest cities across all of Europe, with close to 500,000 people calling it home. It was a packed, rapidly expanding urban centre driven by commerce, constant river activity, and endless movement along the Thames. In this video, I'm using modern artificial intelligence tools to breathe new life into historic paintings and engravings, giving us the ability to shift our viewpoint, adjust camera angles, and navigate through these same scenes in ways the original artists who created them could never have imagined possible. First, I want to spend some time discussing what we refer to today as Old London Bridge, a remarkable structure that I honestly didn't know nearly enough about until I began diving into this research. By the time the 1600s arrived, Old London Bridge had evolved into something far more complex than just a simple river crossing. It had become a densely constructed street that seemed to float above the Thames, creating a vital connection between the City of London on one side and Southwark on the other. Houses, shops, warehouses, chapels, and imposing gatehouses lined every available inch of the bridge so thoroughly and completely that when you looked at it from any distance, it didn't really resemble a bridge at all. Instead, it looked more like an unbroken neighbourhood that somehow stretched itself across the water, defying the river below. The entire structure rested upon a series of narrow stone arches, each one supported by massive stone piers that had been driven deep into the riverbed. But these piers did something else, something unintended and dangerous. They severely restricted the natural tidal flow of the Thames as it tried to pass beneath them. This restriction created incredibly powerful and unpredictable currents in the spaces between the arches. For anyone attempting to navigate river traffic through those arches, the experience was extremely hazardous. Boats faced sudden surges of rushing water, and accidents weren't just occasional, they were disturbingly common. Many boatmen lost their lives trying to shoot the bridge, as it came to be known. The buildings that crowded onto the bridge itself rose multiple stories into the air, often extending outward over the narrow roadway in a way that seemed to defy gravity. The people who lived in these structures made their homes directly above the constant, never-ending movement of carts, horses, pedestrians, and traders passing below their windows day and night. Fire was always a looming threat in these timber-framed buildings packed so closely together. Congestion was simply a fact of life, something unavoidable that everyone accepted. And yet, despite all these challenges and dangers, people continued to live and conduct their business here, generation after generation, making the bridge not just a crossing, but a genuine community. To cross Old London Bridge meant more than simply moving from one side of the river to the other. It meant passing through a vital commercial artery that pulsed with the life of the city, but it also meant walking beneath visible and deliberate reminders of royal authority and political control that were placed there for everyone to see. Below the bridge, the Thames itself functioned as London's most important highway, perhaps even more crucial than any road on land. Barges, ferries, merchant vessels of all sizes, and countless smaller rivercraft crowded the water at all hours, carrying essential goods like grain, timber, coal, cloth, and imported luxury items from distant lands. The river was London's connection to the interior of England, to the ports and markets of Europe, and to the vast Atlantic world that was opening up during this era. This made the bridge a unique point where everyday local life collided and mingled with global trade networks that stretched across oceans. During particularly severe winters, something remarkable would happen. The restricted flow of water beneath the bridge's tightly packed arches could actually cause portions of the Thames to freeze solid. During these rare periods, the river briefly transformed into something almost magical. People would venture out onto the ice, walking and gathering directly below the bridge, creating a striking and surreal contrast to the dangerous, fast-moving water that normally flowed there. This particular view captures the northern entrance to the bridge, the approach that came through the area directly beside St. Magnus the Martyr Church, which you can see positioned to the left in the scene. By the time the mid-1700s arrived, the bridge had deteriorated so severely that city officials finally decided something drastic had to be done. Between 1756 and 1762, the buildings that had crowded and defined Old London Bridge for so many centuries were gradually torn down and cleared away. Although the painting itself dates from the 1700s, it depicts a crossing that had already shaped the physical and social landscape of London for hundreds of years before that. What's truly remarkable is that this is a location you can actually still visit today, standing in almost the exact same spot where travellers once began their crossing. What makes Old London Bridge so remarkable, so worth remembering and studying, is not just its impressive engineering, but its extraordinary endurance as a truly lived space, a place where real people spent their entire lives. It functioned simultaneously as infrastructure, as a bustling marketplace, as a residential neighbourhood, and as a powerful symbol of London itself. Kings and queens crossed over it in grand processions. Common people used it every single day. Traders and labourers worked upon it from dawn until dusk, and newcomers arriving in London for the very first time would first encounter the overwhelming reality of the city at this single narrow crossing point. Old London Bridge was undeniably crowded, often dark and shadowy beneath its overhanging buildings, and frequently unsanitary by any modern standard. It slowed the flow of traffic to a frustrating crawl, created bottlenecks that complicated trade and commerce, and posed constant, serious dangers to everyone who lived and worked upon its creaking timbers and ancient stones. And yet, despite all of these very real problems and challenges, for century after century, it remained absolutely essential to London's identity, economy, and daily life. It was impossible to imagine the city without it. Until the 18th century, it stood as the only permanent crossing of the Thames in the central part of London, which meant that anyone trying to move north or south across the city had no choice but to use it. Sometimes I find myself wishing I could step backwards in time and experience this exact spot the way it once looked, even if only for a single day. For now, though, this artificial intelligence reconstruction seems to be about as close as I can get to fulfilling that dream. This view shows Buckingham House during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Long before the building was transformed into the Buckingham Palace we know today, it was originally constructed as a private townhouse sitting on the western edge of London. The structure was set apart from the crowded heart of the city, surrounded instead by open land and quiet gardens. At that time, this particular area marked the boundary between the urban sprawl of London and the open countryside that stretched out beyond it. It serves as a reminder that even as the city grew denser and more chaotic, its outer edges were still clearly defined and easy to recognize. In September of 1666, London was struck by one of the most devastating fires in its entire recorded history. What began as a small, seemingly manageable blaze rapidly tore through a city that had been built largely of timber, with narrow streets and tightly packed buildings that allowed the flames to spread with terrifying speed, turning the fire into an almost unstoppable force. The first image shows Ludgate completely engulfed in flames, with the old saying, Paul's Cathedral visible in the distance, its great square tower already under serious threat. Soon even this enormous and beloved landmark would be swallowed entirely by the blaze. The second view looks across the Thames near Tower Wharf. On the evening of September the 4th, London appears as one continuous, unbroken wall of fire stretching along the horizon. To the left stands London Bridge, packed with desperate crowds, while to the right the Tower of London narrowly avoids destruction. Old St. Paul's burns fiercely at the very centre of the skyline, its outline glowing against the smoke. Within just a few short days, much of medieval London had been reduced to nothing but ash and ruin. Yet, the fire also marked a major turning point in the city's history, clearing away centuries of dense, unsafe construction and forcing the authorities to rebuild, reshape, and essentially begin the city all over again. Rising above the river, the Tower of London in the 1600s stood at the very heart of royal power in England. By that period, it served as a fortress, an arsenal, a treasury, and one of the most notorious prisons in the entire country. High-profile prisoners accused of treason were held within its cold stone walls. The tower also housed important royal records, weapons, and even the crown jewels, reinforcing its role not simply as a place of punishment, but as a true cornerstone of the English state itself. This scene shows Cheapside in 1638, one of London's most important ceremonial streets during the grand procession of Marie de Medici as she entered the city to visit her daughter, Queen Henrietta Maria, and her son-in-law, King Charles I. Cheapside was not merely a busy commercial thoroughfare, but also a stage for royal spectacle, lined with ornate conduits, crosses, and temporary structures built specifically for public occasions and grand entrances. At the center of the composition stands the famous Cheapside Cross, a well-known landmark and a popular gathering point for citizens. Soldiers, officials, and cheering crowds fill the street beneath the dazzling pageantry. And moments like this one often reflected the growing political and religious tensions of the era, as Henrietta Maria's Catholic faith and her foreign background unsettled a city that was already drifting steadily towards civil war. Today, this same stretch survives as the modern Cheapside in the city of London, near St. Mary-le-Bow, a place where the street itself remains alive with activity, even as its medieval landmarks have long since disappeared from view. This image shows the political and religious complex of Westminster in 1647, seen from across the river at a moment when England itself was deeply divided by conflict and faith. Standing on the left is the old Palace of Westminster, the official seat of Parliament and the recognised centre of political power in the kingdom. By the middle of the 1700s, that very spot had turned into the centre of a growing storm between the King and Parliament, especially through the bloody years of the English Civil War. Right next to it stands Westminster Hall, one of the oldest and most impressive surviving pieces of the old palace. For centuries it was used as a courtroom, a stage for state trials, and a place where the great public gatherings of the nation took place. Its enormous roof had long been a symbol of royal authority, long before the space itself turned into the place where that power was put on trial. To the right rises Westminster Abbey, the spiritual heart of the country. For centuries it had been the place where kings and queens were crowned, where royal funerals were held, and where monarchs were buried, all of it reinforcing the sacred character of the crown itself. Back in 1647, the abbey stood uneasily between tradition and upheaval, with religious divisions tearing at the very foundations of England's institutions. At the centre of the whole scene sit Westminster Stairs, a crowded landing on the river where travellers were constantly coming and going by boat. In an age before bridges and proper paved roads dominated travel, the Thames really was London's main artery, carrying politicians, clergy, messengers, and ordinary people straight to the doorstep of power. The etching shows the Palace of Whitehall back in 1643, when it was the largest royal residence in all of England and the primary home of the monarch. From these very steps that faced the river, kings and courtiers stepped off their boats, which says everything about how central the Thames was to the daily movement of London and to the life of the Stuart court. Spread out along the Thames, Whitehall was not a single palace at all, but a massive complex of halls, chambers, and government buildings where the real business of royal rule was carried out. Most of Whitehall was destroyed by fire toward the end of the 1700s, and today only the banqueting house remains, standing as the last surviving piece of what was once the very centre of royal life. This is Richmond Palace as it looked back in the 1600s and into the early 1700s, one of the most important royal residences outside the heart of London. Originally rebuilt by Henry VIII on the site of an older medieval manor, Richmond became a beloved retreat for Tudor and early Stuart monarchs, offering cleaner air and open space far away from the crowded streets of the city. It was here that Elizabeth I spent her final days, dying at the palace in 1603 and bringing the long Tudor dynasty to its end. Over time, the palace fell out of use and was slowly pulled apart. Today, its grounds live on as part of modern Richmond, with only faint traces of its walls and layout still surviving beneath the streets and riverside paths. Standing here and looking back at these moments, it is hard not to feel how close the past really is. These streets, these buildings, these events shaped the world we live in, and through these reconstructions we get just a small glimpse of what it truly felt like to be there.